The world is kind of a mess. The United States is kind of a mess. Most of our presidents have been a mess. But why is that? Join us today to find out what the Bible, especially in Psalms, actually says. I would love to stand up here and tell you that the world is in really, really good shape. But as you can see from this crazy picture behind me, this is kind of what a lot of the world looks like. It's just, there's war, there's tragedy, there's just so many issues going on with different nations. I would love to stand up here and tell you that the United States is really honestly one nation under God. But we kind of know that's not true. I would love to tell you that all of our presidents have literally sought out God and what He says in His Word, but we know that that's not true either. Because what we've seen from so many presidents and is that when they get into the office, now it becomes about me, my cabinet, I. We hear a lot of I when it comes to things like that. And that kind of makes me cringe. Mostly because of our psalm today and what it has to say. Let's start here in Psalms 2. Verse 1 says this: "Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand and the rulers gather together against the Lord and against His anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters." I always say this: what is wrong with people? What is wrong with presidents and leaders and rulers and government officials? What's wrong with them? Why do they not turn to the very, very source of everything, which is God Himself? Why do they actually take their stand against Him? Do they actually think they're going to win? Because if we take this psalm to heart, it's a reminder that there really is no me, I did this, I created this, I. But instead, there's only a sovereign God who rules over everything. That is why I think I like this psalm so much, is because it reminds me of how powerful and mighty that God really is and how He rules over everything, every single nation on earth. And when these nations and these rulers start getting together, they create what's behind me: war, problems, issues. Let's see what Psalms 2 says. Verse 4. "The one enthroned in heaven," what? "Laughs. The Lord scoffs at them." The reason why is because God hates pride. He hates someone thinking that they did something, because He always has the last word. We learn this from a really, really great story in the Bible, in Daniel in the Old Testament, about King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was a shrewd and powerful ruler who made Babylon into one of the most formidable empires on this earth. But here is one of the scenes in the Bible that we can picture God doing just what He says in Psalms 2, sitting in heaven and laughing. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He has a dream. He can't figure it out, and it's terrifying to him. So he calls in Daniel and asks Daniel to tell him what it means. Look at Daniel 4:24. "This is the interpretation, O king," Daniel says to him. "This is the decree the Most High has issued against my lord, the king." Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar this: "You, Nebuchadnezzar, will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdom of men and gives them to anyone He wishes." Look at what he said. There's going to be a problem in your life until you acknowledge God, the Most High, is sovereign and ruler over everything, your kingdom and all the kingdoms of the world. The king was forewarned. The king was forewarned that he needed to remember that God was above all, but he didn't. Look what happens next. Daniel 4, verse 28, "All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he says, 'Is not this the great Babylon, I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty. Where in the world is God in all of this? Nowhere. Nebuchadnezzar took all the credit on himself. Verse 31 says this, the words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your authority has been taken away from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by, for until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. God says this over Nebuchadnezzar. You're going to act and be kind of crazy, and you're going to act like an animal. Immediately, verse 33 says, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from the people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. God really wanted to get his attention. He really wanted to remind him, no, Nebuchadnezzar, honestly, you did nothing. You did not build this kingdom. I did. The credit needs to go to God himself, not a king. Verse 34 says this, at the end of that time, finally, Nebuchadnezzar got it. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. He finally gets it. He finally gets it, that it's honestly not about him. It's really all about God. Verse 35, all the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He gets it. It's all about God. It's not about people and rulers and nations and kingdoms. It's not about that. It has to be all about God. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? This is this great visual of God that nobody can do something that isn't what God is allowing him to do. God controls everything in this world, and we need to remember that. Verse 36 says, at the time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. But this is why, verse 37, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify who? Not himself anymore, but the King of heaven. Because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. This psalm to me is just this reminder that the leaders of nations actually think that they can overrule God. They think that if they can just reject God's rule in their life, that they're going to somehow stop God's rule on this earth. But that's actually not true. Whether a person rebels against God's rule in his life or not, if he doesn't submit to God, the bottom line is God's going to do what God's going to do. It doesn't matter if someone doesn't believe it. God can override and does override anything that goes on in this world. What God is going to do is one day, despite mankind's rebellion, Jesus is coming back. And he will reign as King of Kings and Lord of Lords on this earth. Now, we see how this all plays out with Jesus. We saw this horrible rebellion in Matthew 27. Jesus is arrested. The Romans think they won. The Jews thought they won. But here you go. Jesus, who is God, who could wipe everyone off of the face of this earth in like a nanosecond. Instead, he humbled himself. And he put up with the beatings and the floggings and the crown of thorns and then the mockings. Imagine being the person who does this. Matthew 27:29. When they had twisted a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Then look what they did to God himself. Then they spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they took the robe off him, put his own clothes on him, and led him away to be crucified. That's a shocking statement. But God was still in control. Because here is how God responded. When men conspired against God, against Jesus, I believe that this was going on. Verse 4, the one enthroned in heaven laughs. It's our psalm. The Lord scoffs at them. He laughs at them because God says, I have a plan. I have a plan that can override anything that you guys do. And what's amazing about this particular psalm, Psalm 2, is that it's considered a messianic prophecy psalm. And we know this because this particular verse in Psalms is used in the New Testament over and over again when referring to Jesus. This psalm is either quoted or alluded to 17 times in the New Testament, more than any other psalms in the entire book of Psalms. Luke 24:44, look at this. Then he said to them, these are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you. This is Jesus talking. That all things must be fulfilled, which were written where? In the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. Jesus spoke, like in the Psalms, all the way back what we're reading, talks about Jesus that will come many, many, many years ahead of time. Acts 4:23 says this, and being let go, they went to their own companions and reported all that the chief priests and elders had said to them. So when they heard that, they raised their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, you are God, who made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, who by the mouth of your servant David had said, why do the nations rage and the people plot vain things? The kings of the earth took their stand and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. The Psalms actually is being quoted in Acts. It's the coolest thing. You can see the Old Testament and the New Testament meshing together. One is a prophecy, we see it fulfilled. Verse 27 says, for truly against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together to do what? To do whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done. Jesus is like, or God's like, I've got this all under control. You can't change things once it's in motion. That is the God we believe in. That is the God that we trust in, that we put our faith in, one who is in so control of everything. It's so amazing. Acts tells us that David wrote this Psalms, 1,000 years before Jesus shows up? Now, the interesting thing about this psalm is it's kind of twofold, okay? Because he's talking messianic, but he's also talking about what's going on in the day of David. David would be dealing at this time with earthly kings. These would be kings who rebelled against God. But the reminder with this Psalms is this, that God wins. God wins. He just does. No matter how many politicians are raging against God, God has a future for this world. And that's why he laughs. I love this verse. He just sits in heaven and laughs. He's like, wow, puny little men and women, it's kind of sad. They think they know it all. They actually know nothing. I remember this when we were on vacation one time, standing in line at a hotel. I started talking to the lady that was standing there, and she actually was a scientist. And I said, wow, you must believe in God because you get to see the most amazing things, amazing creations between microscopes and telescopes. And it shocked me when she responded with, I don't believe in God at all. And I couldn't even believe it. This happened when I went with Cheyenne when she got her ultrasound for her little baby that's inside of her. And on the screen was little baby Susie, 18 weeks old in the womb with eyes, nose, little feet and toes, and a heartbeat that just beat and beat and beat. And I said to the technician, how in the world can anyone not believe in God after seeing that? Her response was this, well, that and science. And I'm thinking, are you joking? There's kind of nothing really scientific about the creation of a baby. But that's the attitude. of people. And God sits on his throne and he just laughs. He's like, what is wrong with you people down there? Because he knows exactly what's going to happen. I love it that Jesus is coming back. He's going to set this world right. No more of this behind me. No more wars and no more, all the bad stuff that comes along with that. He'll set up his throne in Jerusalem. It's kind of like someone said, when Jesus comes back, it's kind of like this whole idea of when your kids play and they're fighting with their dad. The dad can always pretend like the child's winning. But there's no way. The dad's always bigger. When the dad is ready to win, he will win. And the same goes for God. So after God laughs in Psalms 2, verse 5 says this, then he rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. Because imagine being God. Imagine feeling this anger and wrath. David is writing this because he knows the history of Israel. He knows that God sent Moses to go to Egypt to rescue the Israelites from 400 years of slavery. The Israelites saw more miracles than anyone has ever seen since the world began. They saw God parting the sea. God fed them manna and never let their shoes wear out for 40 years. God gave them this incredible land. God gave them prophets and judges to rule. But they didn't want any of it. They rebelled. You know what they wanted? They were like, we want a king. God's like, trust me, I'm your king. I want to be your king. You don't want a king. A king will ruin you. Nope. We want a king. God said, all right. And he gave them exactly what they wanted. So they chose Saul. But Saul was never God's choice. David would be. King David as we know him. David would be the king of Israel because he had a heart for God. Saul never did. Yes, God allowed him to be the first king, but King David was the one that had God's heart. But one day, David knew this, there would be a true king, a descendant of King David. We know him as Jesus. Look at verse 6 in this Psalms. He said, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will proclaim the decree of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your inheritance, the ends of the earth your possession. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like pottery. 1,000 years before Jesus, we see this as a prophecy about Jesus and when he returns. This is an end times prophecy. Look at verse 9 again. You will rule them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like a pottery. Now let's take this and go all the way to Revelation 19 and see what this says. This is when Jesus returns. Verse 11, now I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. Jesus comes back to make war with all the people that have fought with him and did not believe in him. Look at verse 12. We see Jesus is like meek and mild, and no, his eyes were like a flame of fire. And on his head were many crowns. He had a name written that no one knew except himself. He was clothed with a robe dipped in blood. His name is called the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, followed him on white horses. Look at this. It reminds us of what verse 9 in Psalm says. Out of his mouth goes a sharp sword, that with it he should strike the nations. And he himself will rule them with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. See, that's really, really exciting news to me. I look around and I see all of these nations fighting and war and pride and children dying and people losing their homes. And we just saw this in the Ukraine, like that people are just running for their lives because Russia is trying to invade them. And everything in this world looks so hopeless. But I will tell you why I love this psalm. Because it gives me hope that it's not always going to be like this. Hope says this, Jesus is coming back. But here is a warning to our leaders. You better get some wisdom. Not worldly wisdom, but godly wisdom. Verse 10 says this, therefore you kings, be wise, be warned, you rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Sometimes I think that's what we're missing in this world, and that's why our world looks like this madness behind me. I think the problem a lot of times is we've made Jesus our good old buddy. We've made him our friend. He's just there to make us happy. But you know what? He's Lord. He's King. He's King of Kings. And our job is not to make the King our buddy. We are supposed to serve the King of Kings on this earth. There is a scene in Chronicles of Narnia. The little children enter the land for the first time. They're afraid to meet the lion. We know the lion depicts Jesus. They're sitting at supper, and one of them says, you need to go see Aslan, which is the lion. The little child says, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, Mr. Beaver says. Who said anything about him being safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. I am hoping that this psalm is a great reminder to all of us of the power and the majesty of Jesus. He will reign as king on this earth one day. He will destroy people and kings and nations who have not followed him. And he has told us over and over, prophecy after prophecy, what will happen. Here's what we can do. Verse 12 says this, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you be destroyed in your way. For his wrath can flare up in a moment. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. That's the good news. That's the good news of salvation. We can take refuge in Jesus, not a church, not a religion, not being a good person, but Jesus himself. John 1:12 says this, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe on his name. That's what it takes to become a follower of Jesus, is to receive him into your life. Because Acts 4:12 says this, there is salvation in no other, nor is there salvation in any other. For there is no other name under the heaven given among men by which we must be saved. It's Jesus alone. We have to stop thinking that it's about us, our country, our nation, our president, whatever. We need to remember that God rules and he's sovereign. And this psalm is just a warning. And we need to remember we have been warned. And if you don't know Jesus, please make today the day that you give your life to him. Have a good day.